the planet Zarav Bentauth. 7 had been a battleground for as long as Captain Alex Lawson could remember, a remote, harsh place filled with unending dust storms, blistering heat, and alien species who seemed to fight over every inch of land. Human soldiers had been deployed to the planet for peacekeeping, stationed there to prevent a full-scale war between various alien factions, yet despite their best efforts, peace was always fleeting. Alex had been in the military for over a decade, leading countless missions to areas where peace was nothing more than a dream. He had witnessed things that would haunt others for a lifetime, but for him, it was just another day in the life of a soldier. He had learned to shut off the emotional side of his humanity, focusing only on the mission at hand. Emotions only got in the way of survival, and Alex had learned long ago that survival was the only thing that mattered. On this particular day, Alex's squad had been sent to escort an envoy to a nearby village where peace talks were supposed to take place. The mission was routine, too routine, he thought, and things had gone smoothly at first. The sun was setting, painting the desert landscape with shades of orange and red, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. But as they neared the village, things took a turn for the worse. The air crackled with the sound of distant explosions, and the unmistakable hum of plasma rifles filled the air. The convoy was ambushed. Alien forces, their faces hidden behind dark helmets and armored suits, emerged from the shadows of the dunes, firing upon the soldiers with ruthless precision. The enemy's aim was true, and in moments, several of Alex's men were down, their bodies lying lifeless in the dirt. Alex's training kicked in. He shouted orders to his team, his voice cutting through the chaos. His soldiers took cover and returned fire, but it was clear they were outnumbered and outgunned. Alex's heart raced as he moved from cover to cover, trying to keep his team alive. In the midst of the firefight, something caught his eye. A figure draped in the tattered remains of a once beautiful gown staggered across the battlefield. She was unlike any being Alex had ever seen. Her skin was a shade of violet that seemed to shimmer in the fading light, and her eyes, a deep, glowing green, were filled with both pain and determination. It was the alien princess he had been briefed about, the one who had been sent to mediate the peace talks, but something was horribly wrong. She collapsed, her frail body hitting the sand with a soft thud. The enemy forces continued to fight, but for some reason, they had no interest in finishing her off. Alex didn't have time to understand why. All he knew was that he had to act fast if she was to survive. Without thinking, Alex sprinted toward her. Bullets whizzed by him, and the ground shook with the force of nearby explosions. But he didn't stop. As he reached her side, he saw the gaping wound on her side, a deep, pulsing gash that was bleeding out faster than Alex had ever seen in a human. Her breathing was ragged, and her body trembled, weak from blood loss. Alex knelt beside her, his mind racing. There was no way he could get her back to base in time. The enemy was closing in, and the convoy was too far behind to provide backup. He had to do something, and fast. His eyes scanned the battlefield, his mind searching for a solution, and that's when he remembered the emergency procedure. It was something the medics had briefly mentioned in training. A blood transfusion from a compatible source could save someone's life in dire situations. It wasn't ideal, but it was all he had. The problem was, Alex didn't know if his blood would even be compatible with the alien princess. But it was the only chance she had. With no time to waste, Alex ripped off a piece of his shirt and quickly tied it around the princess's wound, hoping to slow the bleeding. He then moved his hand to his own wrist, using the small blade he carried to make a small incision. Blood began to pool in his palm as he quickly pressed it against her mouth, allowing a small amount to drip into her. He had no idea if it would work, but he couldn't leave her here to die. Alex held his breath, waiting for any sign that his actions had made a difference. At first, there was nothing. The princess lay motionless in his arms, her eyes closed. Then, slowly, her fingers twitched. Her breathing deepened, and her body shifted slightly, as though she was trying to move. It was a small sign of life, but it was enough. Alex kept pressing his blood to her lips, praying that this gamble would work. As the minutes passed, he felt her pulse stabilize, the frantic beating slowing down to a more regular rhythm. The princess's eyelids fluttered, and when they opened, she gazed up at him with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex didn't know what to say. He was still in shock, his heart racing from the adrenaline of the moment. All he could do was give her a reassuring smile, though it felt awkward in the face of the chaos around them. "I'm Captain Alex Lawson," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside his chest. "I'm here to help you." She seemed to understand, and for a moment her eyes softened. Then her gaze flickered over his shoulder, where the enemy soldiers were still advancing. "Don't leave me," she said weakly, her voice filled with desperation. "Please." Alex's heart twisted in his chest. He had never been one to make promises, but there was something about her words, something in her eyes, that made him vow to protect her. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but in that moment, he knew what he had to do. "Stay with me," Alex said, his voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere." He quickly helped her to her feet, his arm supporting her as they both staggered toward the nearby wreckage of an old vehicle. They took cover there, the heat from the fires of battle searing the air around them. The princess leaned against him, her breath shallow but steady, and Alex couldn't help but wonder what had brought them together in this impossible situation. She was royalty, an alien of a species far more advanced than humanity, and yet here she was, depending on him to survive. And despite everything, Alex found himself unwilling to let her go. They remained there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the backup that seemed to never come. The enemy forces grew closer, their movements getting more aggressive. But Alex held his ground. He wasn't going to let her die, not after everything she had been through. When reinforcements finally arrived, the enemy had been pushed back, and the battle was won. But the real story was just beginning. The princess had been saved by Alex's sacrifice, and something in her changed that day. And so, the unlikely bond between the human soldier and the alien princess was formed, not out of duty, but out of a shared sense of survival, and an unspoken connection that neither could explain. Alex didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. The princess was not going to leave his side. Over the following days, the battle for peace was far from over, but the immediate dangers had passed. The air was thick with the smoke of burned-out vehicles and the distant hum of alien ships patrolling the skies. Captain Alex Lawson and Princess Arisana found themselves in a temporary base camp, surrounded by the hum of medical machines and the soft chatter of soldiers. But despite the chaos, a quiet calm had settled between them, one that neither fully understood. As the days passed, the princess's wounds healed, thanks to the blood transfusion Alex had given her. Her body, though physically recovering, was still weak, and it was clear that the emotional toll of what she had endured weighed heavily on her. But there was a new fire in her eyes, something different than before. The gratitude she felt for Alex's actions had grown into something deeper, a connection that neither of them could easily explain. Alex, for his part, was unsure of what to make of it. He had seen countless soldiers survive battles, some of them barely clinging to life. But there was something about the princess's survival, her eyes locked on him as she breathed again, that had changed something inside of him. He couldn't shake the feeling that their fates were now tied together in a way he couldn't understand. She would not leave his side. No matter how much he tried to get her to rest and recover in the medical tents, she insisted on staying near him. Her strange alien ways made it difficult for Alex to know what she needed or wanted, but somehow, their connection began to grow. She would sit beside him at meals, asking questions about human customs and beliefs, her eyes wide with curiosity. He would share stories about his life back on Earth, his childhood in the mountains, his time training to be a soldier, his love for the quiet moments he found when the chaos of the world slowed down. In return, she would tell him about her world, her home on the planet Valora, a place of great beauty and advanced technology. where peace had reigned for centuries. She spoke of the rigid structure of her society, where emotions were often suppressed and duty to her people came before personal desires. It was a world where leaders were chosen based on logic, not love, and where the concept of self-sacrifice was almost foreign. Her voice, though soft, carried a weight, an understanding of what it meant to carry the burden of her position, of knowing that she would one day be expected to rule and make difficult choices for her people. At first, Alex was fascinated by her stories, his mind expanding beyond the war-torn world he knew. Yet, as he listened, he couldn't help but wonder how someone like Arisana, who had been raised in such a controlled and rational society, had ended up here, lying in his arms, surviving the impossible. There was a vulnerability to her, one she had hidden under the crown of her people's expectations, but it was becoming clearer with every conversation, the weight of leadership, of loneliness, of being forced into a role that no one ever asked her about. It all came flooding out as she spoke, piece by piece. In return, Alex began to understand the depth of her situation. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between her duty and her own desires, between her royal position and the emotions she had never been allowed to fully experience. His heart went out to her, and as much as he tried to keep his distance, the bond between them grew stronger. It wasn't just the physical act of saving her life that had tied them together, but the emotional connection that had formed between them in the days that followed. One evening, after the sun had set and the camp had quieted down, Alex sat alone on a small bench near the edge of the base. He looked up at the stars, the familiar sight offering him a brief moment of peace. His mind was racing, torn between his duty as a soldier and the growing feelings he had for Arisana. He had never been one to let emotions get in the way of his work, but there was something about her, something about the way she looked at him, that made it hard to ignore. The soft rustle of footsteps behind him caught his attention. He turned to see Arisana standing a few feet away, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand what he was thinking. She had been quieter than usual that day, her thoughts seemingly far away, and Alex couldn't help but wonder what was going on inside her mind. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper in the stillness of the night. Alex raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You do, huh?" She nodded, stepping closer and sitting beside him on the bench. "You're wondering why I'm still here, why I won't leave you." It wasn't that he didn't have an answer. It was just that he didn't quite know how to explain it. "It's hard to know what to make of this," he said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "You're royalty. You don't belong here, in this war-torn world. You have a kingdom, a people who need you, and yet you're here, with me." "I don't know what's right anymore," she said, her voice tinged with a sadness Alex hadn't heard before. "I was raised to believe in logic, in duty, in the importance of my people. But when I was lying there, dying, I realized that something more than logic kept me alive. It was you, your blood, your sacrifice." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "And now I can't turn away from you. I can't turn away from what you represent. Humanity, emotions, life." Alex was taken aback by her words. He had never thought of himself as someone who represented anything greater than his duty. He was just a soldier, doing his job. But in that moment, he understood. She wasn't just thanking him for saving her life. She was acknowledging that there was more to her existence than the rigid expectations of her people. And for the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand what it meant to feel, to live for something beyond her duty. "You don't have to stay with me," Alex said, his voice softer than before. "I'm not asking you to, Arisana." "I don't want you to feel trapped." She shook her head, her expression determined. "I'm not trapped," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I want to stay. I want to learn about you, about humans, about what makes you fight, what makes you live. There's something about you, something that draws me in, and I can't ignore it." Alex didn't know how to respond. He had never been good with emotions, never good at understanding how other people felt. But in that moment, he realized that maybe he didn't need to understand everything. Maybe it was enough that they were both here, together, trying to make sense of the chaos around them. For the first time in a long time, Alex felt the weight of the world lift slightly from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held or what his relationship with Arisana would become. But for the first time, he wasn't thinking about the war, the politics, or the impossible odds they faced. He was thinking about the person beside him. And in that moment, it was enough. As the night stretched on, the two of them sat in silence, the stars above them a reminder that the universe was vast and unpredictable. But in the midst of it all, they had found something they hadn't expected. A connection, a bond that neither of them had been prepared for. And though neither of them knew where it would lead, they both understood one thing. They were no longer alone. The days that followed were filled with a growing tension. The peaceful base where Alex and Arisana had found refuge had become a quiet battlefield of its own, with whispers of her survival and the bond she shared with a human soldier reaching far and wide. The princess, who was once a symbol of grace and dignity, had now become the subject of scrutiny, not just from her people, but from other alien factions who had always looked down upon the idea of a royal figure mixing with a human. In the weeks that passed, Arisana spent more time with Alex. Their bond deepened as they shared their thoughts and experiences. For her, it was a chance to learn more about humanity, to experience a life so different from her own. For Alex, it was an opportunity to see a side of an alien race he had never considered, a side of vulnerability, fear, and longing that transcended all the battles and politics he had been trained to see. But as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. News of the princess's survival, her choice to stay with Alex, and her refusal to return to her people spread throughout the galaxy. It wasn't long before the Royal Council of her people sent a delegation to retrieve her, to bring her back to Valora where her people had been waiting for her return. They demanded that she resume her duties, and they did not take kindly to her choices. The communication had been sent in a simple, formal message, one that Alex could see had been crafted by people who viewed the situation in a very different light. The message was filled with polite words, but the underlying tone was unmistakable. Arisana was needed back home. The war between the factions, though temporarily quelled, had not truly ended, and her presence was still required. She had a duty to her people, and that duty was far more important than any personal bond she had developed. As the delegation arrived, the tension in the base grew. The officials, alien representatives, and dignitaries from her homeworld made their presence known immediately. Their eyes were filled with expectations, their voices laced with authority, and their demands were simple. They would take Arisana back with them, and she would fulfill her role as a leader, as expected. Arisana stood tall when the delegation arrived, but there was an air of sadness about her, one that Alex had noticed in the past few days. Her resolve was firm, but her heart was torn. She knew she couldn't remain with Alex forever. He was human, and their worlds were too different. But to leave him now, when they had just begun to understand each other, when she had only just begun to experience real emotions for the first time in her life, was a thought that made her heart ache. "You must return to Valora, princess," one of the elders said, his voice harsh but not unkind. "Your people are waiting for you. The galaxy needs you. The balance of power is in your hands." Arisana glanced at Alex, her eyes filled with a sorrow that Alex had come to recognize as a reflection of her inner turmoil. He stood quietly beside her, his arms crossed, trying to remain calm. The air was thick with tension, and it seemed as though time had come to a halt. "I understand my duty," Arisana replied, her voice steady, but there was an edge of something fragile beneath her words. "But I cannot simply leave. I have learned, I have felt, things I never thought I would. Things that are important. I cannot ignore them." One of the other officials stepped forward, his expression one of impatience. "Princess, you have been absent from your people for too long. One of the peace talks are at a critical stage, and your absence has only fueled doubt. Your place is not here. Your place is on the throne. Alex could feel the weight of the words as they hung in the air. He knew this was not a simple political matter. This was a battle for her soul, for her very identity. Erisana had been raised to fulfill a role she had never asked for, to be a ruler and leader in a world that demanded absolute loyalty. She had been taught that emotions were a weakness, that the needs of her people always came first. But now she had seen the world through a different lens. She had experienced the warmth of human connection, the depth of feelings she had never been allowed to explore. Alex had shown her that there was more to life than duty, and in the face of this pressure, Erisana found herself at a crossroads. "You want me to leave?" Erisana asked, her voice firm, yet filled with an underlying sadness. "Then you want me to leave everything behind? My humanity, my emotions?" "Everything I've come to realize." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, Alex saw a shift in the way the delegation looked at her. They were not accustomed to hearing a princess speak this way. Her words were filled with something foreign to them, something they did not know how to handle. One of the officials, an older man with a stern expression, looked at Erisana with a mixture of disappointment and concern. "You are letting personal emotions cloud your judgment. You have a responsibility. Your people will suffer without your leadership." "You cannot abandon them." Erisana's eyes burned with defiance. She had spent her life following orders, playing a part she never truly understood. But now she had discovered something different, something she had never been taught to value. She had found the human side of herself, the side that could feel love, loss, and fear. And it was not something she was willing to throw away. "I will not be forced back into a life I don't want," she said quietly, but with a strength that surprised even her. "I have spent my whole life obeying others, living by their rules, but I will not do it anymore, not at the cost of my own happiness, my own freedom." Alex stood beside her, his presence a quiet but powerful support. He had never imagined that he would be involved in something like this, caught between the royal duties of an alien princess and the human emotions that had so unexpectedly blossomed between them. He had never been one to meddle in politics, never one to fight for something that wasn't his to fight for. But in this moment, as he stood by Erisana's side, he realized that he had come to care for her more deeply than he had ever expected. The decision, however, was not his to make. He was just a soldier, a small part of a much larger machine. But he knew one thing. He would not stand by and watch her be dragged back to a life that would destroy everything she had come to know. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Finally, Erisana turned to Alex, her eyes filled with emotion. I can't go back," she whispered, as if speaking only to him. "Not yet. I need more time." Alex nodded silently, understanding the weight of her words. He knew that whatever decision she made, it would change everything. But in that moment, he also knew that they had to make a choice together. The room fell into a tense silence, the alien officials exchanging glances, unsure of what to do next. They had come to collect the princess, but they had not expected this level of resistance. "We will return to Valora, princess," the elder finally said, his voice resigned. "But we cannot force you. We only ask that you remember your responsibilities. Your people are in need of you. And we will not forget your absence." With that, the delegation turned to leave, their footsteps echoing in the silent room. Erisana stood there for a moment, her chest tight with the weight of the decision she had just made. She knew that there was no easy way forward, but she also knew that her future was no longer something she could let others decide for her. She turned to Alex, a small, tired smile on her lips. "I don't know what will happen next," she said softly, "but I know that I'm not going anywhere. Not yet. And in that moment, Alex realized that they were in this together. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The days that followed Arisana's decision were filled with uncertainty and a sense of quiet resolve as the princess stood her ground, refusing to return to Valora. Her life began to change in ways that no one could have predicted. The air around her was thick with tension, not just because of the political storm that was brewing, but because of the quiet, unspoken understanding that the relationship between her and Captain Alex Lawson had crossed a line. It had moved from a simple act of gratitude to something far more complex, something neither of them could ignore. Alex found himself caught between his duty and his growing feelings for the princess. He had always been a soldier, a man trained to follow orders, to think logically, and to prioritize the mission above all else. But everything had changed the moment he laid eyes on Erisina on that battlefield. She had been a symbol of everything he had been taught to fight against, a figure of royalty, of alien authority. But in saving her, in sharing those quiet moments, he had learned that there was far more to her than the title of princess. She was human in a way he hadn't anticipated, and it was that humanity that had drawn him in. Erisina, on the other hand, was learning to embrace the emotions she had spent a lifetime suppressing. Her people, her society, had taught her to prioritize the well-being of the collective, to place duty above personal desire. Yet for the first time, she found herself questioning everything she had been taught. The more time she spent with Alex, the more she realized that her life could be different. There was a world beyond duty, beyond political obligations, and in Alex, she had seen that world. But the growing connection between them did not go unnoticed. There were whispers among the soldiers, among the alien delegates, and among those who had once been her closest advisors. Erisana's refusal to return to Valora was not just a personal choice. It was a political statement. She had defied her people's expectations, and that defiance had set off a chain of events that no one could have foreseen. Despite her decision, the war was far from over. The hostile alien empire that had once sought to destroy her people was regrouping, and its forces were gathering in the outer reaches of the galaxy. The delicate peace that had been established in the wake of the previous battles was fragile, and there were those who believed that Erisana's absence was a sign of weakness. It wasn't long before the enemy decided to make their move, launching a surprise attack on Valora's borders. The news reached the human base where Alex and Erisana had taken refuge, and it sent shockwaves through both the human and alien factions. Alex, as a soldier, understood the severity of the situation. The war was no longer a distant conflict. It was personal. The enemy forces had come to destroy not just a planet, but everything that had been built over the years, and with Erisana still in hiding, the question of her return was no longer a matter of choice. It was a matter of survival. The military leaders on both sides called for a meeting, and it was clear that a decision had to be made. Erisana, despite her inner conflict, understood the gravity of the situation. Her people were in danger, and her presence was needed more than ever. Yet, as she sat in the war room with Alex, surrounded by military officials and alien representatives, she knew that her future had to be decided not just by her people, but by herself. "Princess," one of the human commanders said, his voice tense with urgency, "your people are under attack. You need to make a decision. Will you return to Valora and lead them, or will you stand here with us?" Alex stood beside her, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. He had never been one to get involved in political matters, but he could sense the weight of the moment. This was bigger than just a battle. It was about Erisana's future, about who she was and what she stood for. Erisana's heart was heavy with the choices before her. She had never imagined that her decision would come to this. It was supposed to be simple. She was a princess, and her duty was to her people. But now, everything had changed. She looked at Alex, seeing in his eyes a reflection of her own uncertainty. He wasn't asking her to stay. He wasn't even asking her to choose him. But there was something in the way he had supported her, in the way he had stood by her side without hesitation, that made her realize just how much she had come to rely on him. "I cannot abandon my people," Erasana said softly, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But I also cannot ignore what I've learned here. I cannot ignore what it means to feel, what it means to be human." The room fell silent, and Alex's gaze met hers. He understood the weight of her words. He knew what it was like to feel torn between duty and personal desires, to be pulled in two different directions by forces that seemed beyond his control. "Then we will fight together," Alex said, his voice firm. "If you choose to return to Valora, I will stand with you. I won't ask you to choose between me and your people, but if we're going to win this war, we need to work together." Erasana looked around the room, seeing the mixed expressions on the faces of the officials and soldiers. They had expected her to make a decision, one that would either end the conflict or lead to her downfall. But now they saw something else. They saw her strength, her willingness to put aside her royal title and fight for what was right. She had been forced into a position of power and responsibility. But now, for the first time, she realized that her future wasn't something she could leave in the hands of others. "I will return to Valora," Erasana said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I will not return as a symbol of power. I will return as a leader who has learned the true meaning of responsibility. I will fight for my people, but I will also fight for what is right, for the future of all of us." The room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, the officials began to nod. There was a sense of respect in their eyes, a recognition of the strength she had shown. It was clear that her decision, though difficult, had won them over. Alex watched as Erasana stood, her back straight and her eyes focused on the future. He knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The battle ahead would be one of survival, not just for Valora or humanity, but for the future they had begun to build together. As the meeting came to an end, Alex and Erasana walked together through the base, the weight of their decision heavy on their shoulders. The war was not over, but they had made their choice. Together they would face whatever came next. And as they stood side by side, looking out at the horizon, both of them knew one thing for certain. No matter what the future held, they would face it together.